June 1944. 240 kilometers off the coast of French West Africa, the Atlantic swell is a deep, oily blue, and the air smells of diesel and salt. Beneath the surface, a German submarine limps along at periscope depth, her batteries low, her captain uneasy. Above her, unseen, a task group of American warships has been hunting for days, reading her radio chatter, closing the net with a patience that borders on obsession. Then, without warning, the sea erupts. Depth charges slam the hull like a giant's fist against a steel drum, and the submarine, wounded and blind, is forced to the surface. What happens in the next 20 minutes will make history, though almost nobody outside a small circle of American naval officers will know it for decades. Sailors leap from a destroyer escort into the churning water. They swim towards the stricken vessel, climb aboard her still-warm hull, and disappear down her conning tower hatch into a darkness thick with the fear that she might be rigged to explode at any second. She is not abandoned in the way her crew intended. She is boarded, alive, her engines still running, her secrets still sitting in cabinets and code books, largely undisturbed. This is the story of U505, the only enemy warship captured on the high seas by the United States Navy since the War of 1812, and one of the most remarkable intelligence prizes of the Second World War. It is a story of obsessive planning, extraordinary individual courage, and a secret so tightly guarded that the Navy told the German government its own submarine had gone down with all hands, purely so that Berlin would never learn the truth. Why does this matter? Because a submarine captured almost intact, rather than sunk, hands an enemy something far more valuable than a victory. It hands them a window into how the whole war beneath the waves is actually being fought. By the middle of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had become the single most important campaign of the Western War, and Britain knew it better than anyone. Every convoy that failed to arrive was a direct threat to the ability of the United Kingdom to keep fighting at all. Germany's U-boat fleet, coordinated by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, had for a time come remarkably close to strangling Britain's Atlantic lifeline, sinking merchant shipping faster than British and American yards could replace it. In the worst months, losses ran into the hundreds of thousands of tons, and convoy escorts, however brave, simply lacked the numbers, the range, and often the technology to hunt submarines faster than submarines could hunt merchantmen. The core of the problem was information. The Allies had, since the earliest years of the war, been working to break German naval codes, and Bletchley Park's success against the Enigma cipher machine had already proven itself a war-winning tool. But Naval Enigma, the version used by U-boats, was harder to crack than its Army and Air Force cousins, because it employed a fourth rotor and stricter operating procedures. Codebreakers could read messages for stretches, then lose the thread entirely when the Germans changed their settings or introduced new equipment, plunging the Allies back into darkness for weeks at a time, weeks in which convoys sailed blind into wolf packs. What the Allies desperately needed was not cleverness alone, but material. A physical Enigma machine. Its rotor wirings, its settings books, its short signal codes, taken directly from a U-boat before its crew could destroy them, would let cryptanalysts leap years ahead of guesswork. Several such captures had already happened, most famously the seizure of documents from U505 back in May 1941, an operation so sensitive that the Admiralty kept it secret even from most of its own staff. But by 1943, German naval engineers had introduced a new four-rotor Enigma and changed their weather reporting codes, and the flow of intelligence dried up once again. Existing solutions, however brilliant, kept expiring. Each fix was temporary. Each capture bought only months. The war beneath the sea seemed permanently locked in a cycle where the Allies solved one puzzle only to have Berlin quietly change the lock. Compounding the difficulty was the sheer danger of trying to capture a U-boat rather than simply sink her. Submarines were built to scuttle themselves. Standard German procedure, drilled into every crew, was to open the boat's vents and valves the moment she was forced to the surface under attack, flooding her and sending her to the bottom within minutes, taking whatever secrets she carried with her. To capture one intact, an attacking force would need to disable her so thoroughly that her crew abandoned ship in a panic, yet not so thoroughly that she sank before anyone could get aboard. It was, in the words of the men who eventually attempted it, rather like trying to catch a falling glass without breaking it or spilling a drop. There was also the question of timing, and here the arithmetic worked entirely against the attacker. A forced to the surface U-boat, her crew already trained to abandon within seconds, might remain afloat for only a handful of minutes before the sea claimed her. A boarding party first had to be alerted, then lowered into small boats, then motored across open water still churned by shell fire in the wake of circling destroyer escorts, then climb a wet and possibly listing hole, then locate and force open a conning tower hatch that the fleeing crew may have tried to jam behind them. Every one of those steps devoured seconds the submarine simply did not have to spare. No standing Allied doctrine existed for this sequence in the earlier years of the war, because no commander had judged the risk worth taking against a boat that was, from any conventional naval standpoint, already as good as sunk. It took a particular kind of stubbornness to argue that the extra danger to one's own men was worth it for the intelligence prize that might, or might not, still be sitting inside. The man who decided this impossible task was worth doing anyway was Captain Daniel Viet Gallery, a bullish, imaginative American naval officer given command of a hunter-killer task group built around the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal in early 1944. Gallery had studied the problem of anti-submarine warfare intensely and had become convinced that a live capture was not only possible but hugely valuable, and he drilled his sailors specifically for it, something almost no other task group commander in the Atlantic thought to do. Before Guadalcanal ever left port, Gallery had his men rehearsing boarding parties, complete with instructions on how to shut U-boat vents, disconnect scuttling charges, and secure documents using mocked-up compartments built from whatever the crew could improvise. It was unglamorous preparation for an operation nobody could guarantee would ever occur. The task group itself combined the escort carrier with a screen of destroyer escorts, smaller, nimbler vessels fitted with sonar, depth charges, and hedgehog projectors that fired a pattern of small mortar-like bombs ahead of the ship rather than dropping them astern, a technique that dramatically improved the odds of a fatal or crippling hit. Guadalcanal's aircraft, meanwhile, could range far out ahead of the group, scanning the ocean and vectoring the destroyer escorts onto contacts picked up by radio direction finding and decrypted signal traffic. It was, in effect, a mobile hunting party built specifically to find, wound, and then capture rather than simply destroy. On the morning of June 4, 1944, off the coast of what is now Mauritania, that patient hunting paid off. Sonar operators aboard the destroyer escort USS Chatelaine picked up a firm contact. Depth charges followed within minutes, and beneath the waves, U505, commanded that day by Oberleutnant Harold Lang, was rocked violently by near misses that jammed her diving planes and forced her, unable to control her depth, back up towards the surface. As she broke through, deck guns and aircraft raked her conning tower with fire, and Lang, wounded and with several of his crew already dead or injured, gave the order every U-boat captain was trained to give in such a moment. Abandon ship. Scuttle the boat. What happened next made the difference between a footnote and a landmark. Because Gallery's ships had held their fire the instant German sailors began pouring out of the hatches, and because a boarding party under Lieutenant Albert David had been standing ready for precisely this moment, U505 was still floating, still largely undamaged below the waterline, when American sailors reached her. David led his men across in a small boat and up onto the hull, then down through the conning tower hatch into a boat that was, by all accounts, eerily quiet, her diesel engine still turning over, seawater beginning to spurt through an open strainer valve that the fleeing crew had opened to scuttle her. The boarding party found demolition charges already set with a delay fuse and disconnected them with minutes to spare. They found the ship's Enigma machine still bolted to its table. They found code books, charts, and the short signal weather codes the German Navy used to compress radio traffic, all still sitting where the crew had left them in their scramble to escape. The submarine herself is worth pausing on for a moment, because for viewers unfamiliar with U-boats, the scale can be hard to picture. A Type 9 sea boat, like U505, measured a little over 76 meters in length, roughly the span of 2 Olympic swimming pools laid end to end. Yet inside, she was cramped almost beyond imagination. Her interior no wider in places than a modern bus, packed with pipework, valves, and bunks stacked so close that off-duty crew often slept in shifts on the same mattress another man had just vacated. She displaced around 1,120 tons submerged, was powered by 2 diesel engines for surface running and electric motors for underwater silence, and could remain at sea for months at a time, which made her exactly the kind of long-range raider capable of menacing convoys far out into the mid-Atlantic, well beyond the reach of most land-based aircraft in the early years of the war. She had been built at the Deutsche Werft yard in Hamburg, one of a family of Type 9 boats specifically designed with the range to operate far from home waters, unlike the smaller Type 7 that made up the bulk of the U-boat fleet and was better suited to the shorter crossings of the North Atlantic. Type 9 boats like U505 could carry enough fuel to reach the coast of West Africa, the Caribbean, or even further, and it was precisely this long endurance that had brought her into the patch of ocean off Mauritania where Gallery's task group eventually found her. Her diesel engines, when running on the surface, produced a low, heavy throb that sailors likened to a large lorry idling at a distance, while submerged and running on batteries she could move in near silence. A hush broken only by the occasional creak of her pressure hull adjusting to the crushing weight of the sea. It was this contrast between noisy surface running and near-total underwater silence that made U-boats so difficult to track using early war sonar and hydrophone equipment, and so dependent, by 1944, on the kind of direction-finding and code-breaking that Gallery's task group was built around. Her most valuable cargo, from an intelligence perspective, was not a weapon at all, but a machine, roughly the size of a small typewriter, fitted into a wooden case and bolted to a table in the radio room. The 4-rotor naval Enigma used aboard boats like U505 encrypted messages by passing an electrical signal through a series of rotating wheels, each wiring letters to different letters depending on its position, a process that scrambled a message into what looked like meaningless noise unless the receiving operator possessed an identical machine set to the same daily configuration. Alongside the machine itself, boarding parties recovered the settings books and short signal codes that told operators which rotor positions to use on which day, documents that were, in practical terms, far more valuable than the machine, since Enigma machines themselves had already been examined by Allied codebreakers on previous occasions, but the current settings and code books changed constantly and were the real key to reading fresh traffic. Once secured, U505 was taken under tow, an extraordinary feat of seamanship in itself, hauled more than 1,700 kilometers to Bermuda by a task group that had to disguise their catch from the rest of the world. Gallery's superiors understood immediately what they had. If Berlin learned the boat had been captured rather than sunk, German Naval Command would assume, correctly, that her Enigma settings, code books, and short signal ciphers were now in Allied hands and would change every one of them overnight, closing the intelligence window as completely as if nothing had ever been recovered. So the United States Navy did something almost unheard of. It censored the story entirely, holding captured crew members in isolation from other prisoners of war and from the outside world for the remainder of the conflict, and allowed the German Navy to continue believing U505 had been lost with all hands. Not a whisper of the capture reached the press until after Germany's surrender in 1945. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Material recovered from U505 was rushed to the Office of Naval Intelligence and, through Allied liaison, to the codebreakers who needed it most. It arrived at a moment when it could do real good, feeding directly into the ongoing effort to track U-boat dispositions in the run-up to the Normandy landings that same month, ensuring that convoy routes and anti-submarine patrols could be planned with a clarity that a fully alert, fully secretive Kriegsmarine would never have permitted had it known its ciphers were compromised. It is worth setting this single, spectacular capture against the wider Allied and German record. The Royal Navy had achieved its own celebrated hauls earlier in the war, most notably from U505 in 1941, an operation kept so secret that even Winston Churchill was said to have limited it to only a handful of trusted officers, and that capture is generally credited with a major breakthrough into naval enigma at a critical juncture. Germany, for its part, never managed an equivalent coup against the Allies at sea, partly because Allied naval codes, while occasionally read for periods by German intelligence, were never broken with the depth or consistency that Bletchley Park achieved against Enigma, and partly because Allied convoy escorts rarely broke down into the kind of chaotic, document-strewn abandonment that made U505's capture possible. Where German attempts at intelligence coups tended to rely on wireless intercepts and traffic analysis, the American and British approach, when it worked, relied on physical seizure of the machines and books themselves, a cruder but often far more decisive method. The United States task group's rehearsed, deliberate approach to capturing a submarine intact, rather than simply sinking her, had no real German counterpart, since the Kriegsmarine was fighting a defensive war beneath the waves by 1944 and had neither the opportunity nor the doctrine to attempt anything similar against Allied vessels. Assessing the historical impact of the U505 capture requires some honesty about what can and cannot be proven. Historians broadly agree that material recovered from the boat provided a genuine, if narrow, boost to code-breaking efforts already well underway by mid-1944, at a point when the Battle of the Atlantic had already turned decisively in the Allies' favor, thanks to improved radar, escort carriers, long-range aircraft, and earlier code-breaking successes. It would be an overstatement to claim U505 alone won the Atlantic War, since by June 1944 German U-boat losses were already running catastrophically high and Donit's fleet was a shadow of its 1942 strength. What the capture did provide, beyond any specific intelligence gain, was confirmation and refinement, helping analysts corroborate codes and procedures at a moment when precision mattered enormously ahead of the Normandy invasion. Perhaps its greatest long-term impact, though, was psychological and historical rather than tactical, a demonstration that with sufficiently obsessive preparation, an enemy warship could be taken whole rather than destroyed, a lesson that shaped post-war thinking on boarding operations and submarine security alike. U505 herself survives to this day, and this is perhaps the most remarkable coda to the whole affair. Rather than being scrapped or quietly sunk as a target after the war, she was preserved, and in 1954 she was moved to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where she remains on public display, one of the very few German U-boats anywhere in the world that visitors can walk through and see close up, still bearing the outline of a genuine wartime capture rather than a museum reconstruction. Daniel Gallery, the officer whose obsessive rehearsals made the capture possible, was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, and Lieutenant Albert David, who led the first men down into that dark and possibly booby-trapped hull, received the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest award for valor, for an act of raw physical courage performed in near-total silence, far from any battlefield glory. So return for a moment to that morning in June 1944, to the moment the sea erupted and a submarine that should, by every rule of war, have gone down with her secrets intact instead sat wallowing on the surface, waiting. A handful of sailors chose to swim towards danger rather than away from it, climbing down into a hull that might have been rigged to kill them, because their commander had spent months insisting that the impossible was worth attempting. What they achieved was not merely the sinking of an enemy vessel, an outcome the Atlantic War had already delivered hundreds of times over, but something rarer and stranger, the capture of an enemy whole, secrets and all, without her ever knowing she had been caught. Germany believed, until the war's end, that U505 rested somewhere on the ocean floor with all hands lost. In truth, she was sitting in an American harbor, then on a flatbed, then in a museum, teaching visitors for 7 decades and counting exactly how close the Battle of the Atlantic really was. A boat, built to vanish into the deep, instead became one of the most visible relics of the entire war. That, in the end, is the story of U505. Not sunk, not lost, taken.